Hey, this is Jacob Eben. Thanks for tuning in. I recently started working on a new study of a particular set of Torah commands, and in the process of working on that, it has reminded me of the fact that the observance of commands and the understanding of those commands goes beyond just relying on the text, for better or for worse. It often goes beyond that, and maybe it always goes beyond that, even though we may be intending to focus on the text itself. Obviously, most of us probably either dismiss the rabbinic traditions, at least dismiss them as being authoritative. A lot of us recognize that the oral law is largely just a matter of opinions that have accumulated over the years and just turned into being treated as if they were somehow authorized or as if they were somehow authoritative. A lot of us probably recognize that in one way or another. But going outside of that, even amongst those of us that would be opposed to rabbinic traditions and such, I think that there can be similar behaviors which are unintentionally engaged in. That there are new oral laws or new oral traditions that are actively being created even outside of the rabbinic or orthodox spheres. And in this video, I wanted to delve into some of those behaviors because I believe that in the future, whenever that future may be, that in the future things are going to be very different from how they are now. That right now, everyone is doing what is right in their own eyes. And I don't mean that in the sense that everyone is just doing the wrong thing or everyone is doing evil and so forth. That among those that recognize the Torah, everyone is doing what is right in their own eyes. And sometimes that may be good and sometimes that may be the not correct view of certain commands or the not correct behaviors associated with those commands. And while right now it may be seen as not having much effect, or maybe the stakes don't seem as high because everyone's doing what is right in their own eyes, in the Torah society, in a Torah observant nation, this becomes a matter of dealing with people's lives. It's easy to not really acknowledge the potential significance of that or to acknowledge the future significance of that because right now we're all in our own little tiny groups or even just individuals figuring out what we believe based on our own personal understanding of things. And maybe there are people associated with us, maybe immediate family, or maybe small congregations. And even between those small groups, there may still be plenty of disagreement about certain issues, whether it be the calendar or whatever. And if we recognize how the Torah is set up, we can see that it was intended to be a national law. It is intended to be a law for a legal system to actually enforce, not just for an individual to understand their own personal walk with God, that it goes far beyond that, because not only is there a requirement for people to correct other people, as I would see it in Leviticus 19:17, but it gets into, in the Torah society, very real legal punishments for situations where a person may, in our current situation, may just be saying, this is just my view on it. What I want to invite us to consider throughout the course of this video is the subject of how is it that we are approaching the text. For example, with regard to general principles, how are we to derive general principles from the text? Is that something which is legitimate, and to what degree? And also considering the nature of these oral traditions, whether it be the rabbinic traditions or whether it be things which are effectively very similar to them today, even though they may not be recognized as that, at least not regularly. And I want to think about those things in the context of the future Torah society. To start off with, let's briefly consider the situation with the oral traditions, the rabbinic traditions, and I know for me and for a lot of people that I've spoken with as a result of the channel, a lot of us have gone through some sort of Hebrew roots pipeline in the process of beginning to recognize the Torah. And sometimes around that time or in the process of doing that, that has also involved some sort of dabbling in the rabbinic way of doing things. For me, whenever I first decided that I believed that the Torah is what Elohim wants, I believe that God wants us to follow His law. Whenever I first recognized that, I didn't necessarily know all that the Torah said, and I didn't know whether certain things were in the law or whether certain things were not in the law. And so whenever I would begin to try to observe, one of the reference points that I used was how certain Jewish practices were done. And of course, sometimes that is based on what the written Torah says, and sometimes it's very far off from what the written Torah says, even sometimes being contradictory to it. In the process of attending some congregations, for example, whenever I was attending some Messianic congregations, I noticed that there were times or there were circles where the rabbinic practices were actually acknowledged to a greater degree than the practices of the written Torah, than the commands of the written Torah. For example, the skull caps would often be worn, and yet the tzitzit would not be made onto people's garments. And of course, I can't really know what other people are thinking, or I can't know the exact motivations behind all of those sorts of things. But one thing that I kind of recognized was that it seemed like people sometimes wanted to be Jewish. They wanted to seem as if they were Jewish, and yet, for whatever reason, the Torah itself, the written commands, were not held at the same level of importance. And then other times, of course, I'm sure it was just as innocent as people not being aware, and that the voice advocating for certain rabbinic practices tended to be louder or more frequent than the voice advocating abiding by the written Torah. I know based upon some of my past experiences, and I know based upon some stories which other people have related to me, which sounded very similar, that one distraction that often comes up is the focusing on trying to reconcile Paul, trying to explain how Paul is not actually teaching against the Torah, and spending more time on that than actually studying the Torah. And that seems very counterproductive to me, even from the perspective of someone holding the idea that Paul had to be teaching the Torah. Because the point, I assume, would be that the Torah is what is important. And so that is just taking away from trying to understand what the commands of the Torah actually are. And it appears that some people miss out massively because of that misdirection of focus. One other thing I've recognized is that some people really like amplified Bibles or biblical scriptural commentaries. And when it comes to focusing more on the Torah or focusing on the Hebrew side of things, obviously that's going to tend to be finding a very nice bound Tanakh that has rabbinic commentaries built into it. So naturally that is going to lead a person in a particular direction. And I also recognize that people on average seem to be far more attracted to a very generalized message, more of a life advice type message, or advice on coping, or advice on what would be considered a spiritual outlook on things. People tend to be far more interested in getting a message about that rather than getting a message about specific things and specific ways of how to understand certain commands and apply them. Those are some of the obvious ways where these overtly orthodox or rabbinic positions tend to work themselves in, or these different frames, these ways of looking at the text and these generalized beliefs. Those tend to work their way in through means like that. But I want us to consider things beyond that as well, because it's easy to focus on, for example, it's easy to focus on the rabbinic traditions and to point out how they go against the Torah, how sometimes they will take passages out of context, even to the degree of taking the no or the not out of a command and twisting it into the opposite of what it says. Most of us probably know about examples like that, and it's easy to say, well, that's obviously a problem. What I have found, at least in my own personal experience, is that focusing on the other, or focusing on something that we know is not the right way to do it, often tends to take the focus off of what we personally are doing, or what our quote-unquote side is doing. Early on in my pursuit of following the Torah, I became aware of the Karaite groups. I became aware of the way of looking at the text where it's emphasizing the plain meaning, as it might be called. Instead of focusing on what would be considered an overly literal view, instead of focusing on what would be considered an overly metaphoric view, and of course not paying attention to numerology, not creating these codes and stuff to make some secret meaning out of the text to say whatever we want. of course, not paying attention to that, but instead having a more plain view of it, that if it's intended to be metaphoric, that we want to recognize that. If it's just plain speaking, if it's just more literal, then we want to recognize that. As I was approaching the Torah, even early on, that resonated a lot more with me than these ideas that are highly subjective and these ideas that basically anyone can fill in the blanks with their own personal beliefs. I became aware of the Karaites and those general views as I was exposed to this particular DVD that was circulating at this congregation I had started attending. It was a DVD talking about one particular Hebrew Matthew manuscript, and it was comparing that manuscript with the more common Greek manuscript, at least discussing some of the differences and sharing one of the generalized Karaite outlooks in the process. And so that led me to look more into that particular group and to look at what they were saying about the text, because that made a lot more sense to me than some of the rabbinic claims that I had been seeing up to that point, because I would see things that would say, this is just how it is, and there would be no textual justification for it, no justification based on the actual text of the Torah or text of Scripture as I would have seen it at the time. It almost seemed entirely arbitrary, entirely a matter of just people's opinion that they had at some point in the past. And of course, at the time, I was also exposed to these different anti-Pharisaic views. They're present especially in the Gospel of Matthew. I knew there was an emphasis on how the Pharisees were teaching that their ways, these doctrines of men, were supposedly the command of God, and of course they were not. This pursuit of just the Torah, no traditions, that made a lot of sense to me. But after a while, I kind of had a rude awakening in that regard. I began to recognize that there are certain ways that things were done. For example, all of the rules that they have regarding moon sighting. And whenever I say they, obviously, Karaites in general don't necessarily all agree on every single issue. I mean, just like any group for that matter. But the more commonly espoused ideas, the more popular ideas on this, they don't necessarily agree, or at least they're not explicitly said in the Torah, even though it's framed as if it is. As I began to recognize that, and as I began to recognize some other things, which I've talked about in some of my other videos, like my video about prophets and prophecy, it was around that time that I started recognizing myself as Torah-centric rather than being Karaite. And after that, I was exposed to the Samaritan views on things and some other groups, and I recognized that even though many of these other groups did not recognize the rabbinic traditions or rejected rabbinic traditions as having any authority, even though there would be that recognition, it was clear that there are other traditions at play. It's clear that there are Samaritan traditions, for example, that aren't just a matter of the text, and sometimes very clearly that is the case. And as time has gone on, I've recognized that this same behavior, these same practices of these oral traditions, whether they're rabbinic traditions or whether they're from some other source, that these same practices exist whether we intend them to or not. Even if we're trying to make things be completely without tradition or without that class of behaviors associated with how we're looking at the text, how we're observing the commands, etc., even if that's our intention, that these same things, that this oral Torah behavior still tends to exist. What I want to do is go into some examples of that and some of the types of that behavior as I would see it. But first I want to talk about what is it that is the ideal? What is it that we want to do? Or, in my opinion, what is it that I am wanting to do as I focus on the Torah text? And I've been talking recently about the idea of focusing on the Hebrew wordings and concepts. That probably seems pretty obvious at face value, focusing on the Hebrew wordings, focusing on the ancient Hebrew concepts, and focusing on what the Torah text says, and not focusing on the therefores, not focusing on the it says this and it says this, therefore we can infer this and therefore we can infer that. Instead of that, focusing on the Torah text wordings. And in my view, this is easier said than done. This is far easier said than done because it gets into the realm of personal beliefs oftentimes, unintentionally. once we get outside of particular wordings in the text, we are delving into the realm of personal beliefs. And the fact is that for most of us, Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, is not our native language. And for me, English is my native language, and Hebrew is a pursuit that has come about much later in life. Whenever I'm thinking in my mind, whenever I am speaking to myself in my mind or formulating ideas in my mind, generally speaking, it is in English. Even whenever I'm focusing on Hebrew words, even when I'm focusing on the Torah text, my mind starts to easily drift into English wordings and naturally drifts into English ideas from the culture. And whenever something like that happens, we're very easily getting into things which could be outside beliefs, outside ideas. The English language, any language, has all kinds of ideas that are inherently baked into particular wordings, particular ways of describing things. And those ideas are not necessarily implied by the Torah text. And a complicating factor in that regard is that ancient Hebrew is basically a dead language. Even though we have modern Hebrew, the meanings of the words, the categories of meaning present for the Hebrew words is not the same. There are even some words in ancient Hebrew which we have clearly lost the scope of meaning for them. So even though there may be this ideal of focusing on the Torah text, focusing on those particular Hebrew wordings and that frame of mind from the time, even though this ideal is here and that ideal is clear, in some ways it's definitely easier said than done. Now that we've considered what hypothetically might be a more ideal way of looking into the Torah, studying the Torah, and seeking to understand it and seeking to apply it as a result, at least in my opinion, now that we've considered that, now I want to turn our attention to what is going on in the rabbinic oral traditions. What is going on in the so-called oral Torah, however it's going to be framed. And I mentioned before that in my background, first I just recognized this as, well, I guess this is the Jewish way of doing things, and I didn't know any difference. I just assumed it was the same as the Torah, and then later on I became aware of the distinction between these things, and of course I mentioned the framing that appears in the Gospel of Matthew, or at least in parts of the Gospel of Matthew, how much of what the rabbis or the Pharisees at the time were teaching, they were teaching the doctrines of men as if they were commands, and they were not commands. And for some reason, whenever I looked into some of these oral traditions, whenever I looked into some of these rabbinic documents in traditional writings, I saw some just what I would consider crazy stuff. Whenever I was first looking at it, I remember coming across their opinions on what to do in the case that a woman gave birth to a horse, and just crazy stuff like that, things that I would have seen as just completely nutty. And having had those experiences early on, that kind of set me against it in a way. And later on, I realized that not all of it is as crazy as those certain parts of it, even though there are obviously problems and a lot of problems in the traditional writings and the things that they say as a result of that and the ways that they apply it. Obviously, there are a lot of issues with that. But I wanted to recognize that a lot of it, in the way I view it now, a lot of it is just like any other person's opinion. A lot of it is just like the opinions that you might see today. It's just that they may be more informed. That doesn't mean that they're more right or anything. They're all human, of course. But I recognize now that there is a process that's going on a lot of the times. And this may not be an explicit process, but it's just a pattern that I am observing in many of these situations in these rabbinic writings or in the oral law. Most of it, in my opinion, is not just about arbitrarily adding new laws. It's not about just making stuff up or ripping things out of context just to do whatever they want to do. That's not how I see it. A lot of it seems to be about trying to tell people what the reasons are for commands or what the intent is behind a command, and then going about constructing an idea of how to observe that command and apply it out of that frame. They're constructing a frame around the command, and then they're exploring these different cases, oftentimes exploring very extreme or edge cases through the frame that they have built. And as a result of this, and this may not have even been intended originally, but it has turned into kind of binding common law in some cases. Things which, at least some of the time, may have just been seen as people's opinions, people's interpretations, evolved into being supposedly authoritative and maybe even almost as if it were the Torah. Now, obviously, that result is a problem. Obviously, this issue of common law, that's not something that we see in the Torah. There is a system of judges. There's a hierarchy of judges discussed in the Torah. These judges make judgment. If a person brings the case to the judges and the judgment is issued, obviously it's supposed to be binding, and that's something which is discussed in Deuteronomy. However, turning that into essentially Torah for all to observe for all time is not something which is described in the Torah as I see it. And so that would clearly be a problem in my view. Aside from applying those opinions in that way, the other part of this process, which I have seen probably criticized the most of any of it, has been the addressing and exploring of these edge cases, has been the discussion of, well, how is this command going to be applied? How is this command going to be applied in some particular scenario? And a lot of times I've seen people criticize it and say, it's just obvious, that it should just be obvious based on what it says in the Torah. And interestingly enough, that's sometimes what the rabbis discussing those issues will say within those rabbinic traditions. They'll say, well, this is just obvious. It should be treated such and such way. And then there will be some other rabbi that will say, well, no, it's obvious it should be treated some other way. In my view, exploring these edge cases actually makes sense because there is a system of judges for a reason. It even talks about in the narrative of the Torah, and it talks about in the Torah if a case is too difficult. So there could be a situation, some edge case, where someone needs to make a decision about it. And of course, that would be applying to someone's particular case in that scenario. So in my view, it makes sense to explore the limits of the command, to explore even improbable situations, and try to understand how to apply the command. The issues that I see with this process, beyond just the applying of it as common law, is the process of telling people what the reasons are for the commands, and then the process of constructing an idea of how to observe the command, or constructing a frame around the command, whether it be directly as a result of that reason or otherwise. That's because most of the commands in the Torah do not say what the reason is. And while many of these rabbinic traditions may try to cite scriptural basis for their understanding of the command, what they think the reason is behind it, and so forth, while they may attempt to provide a citation, a lot of times that citation is not clearly about this subject. It may be talking about some other subject that's only peripherally relevant. Or it may, in fact, be something extremely general that is just creating kind of an opening for someone to project what they personally think onto it, like what specifically is meant by being holy or something like that. And that's an example that came up in regard to a command that I've been studying recently. The idea that it says we're supposed to be holy or be kodesh, and so what that means, according to that rabbinic view, was that means to not interfere with nature. And that is something which is just not said. That is something which is not described, especially when we're looking at those particular commands in the Torah. Clearly that is a belief which is being extrapolated from other ideas and then projected onto that, then being applied onto this more general or more vague command. And then as a result of that, there may be this framework that's being built around that idea, that if we understand the command in that light, in the light of the reason that they personally believe for the command, this means we need to observe the command in this set of ways. And the issue that I have with that is that this set of ways that is created, this frame that's constructed around the command, oftentimes it is not based upon what the command actually says directly and explicitly. It's based upon outside ideas being brought in and added onto it. And maybe those ideas make sense, and I'm sure that they make sense to the people that are suggesting this is how the command is supposed to be observed. But in many cases, this deviates far from what the Torah actually says about the command. And I don't mean that in the sense of exploring these edge cases. I don't mean that in the sense of trying to figure out how the Torah command applies to certain situations. But what I mean is their explanation for how it applies is based upon these non-textual wordings. These wordings which are not actually present in the text of the Torah, especially in the text of that particular command. And I think that recognizing these types of behaviors, recognizing these patterns that occur in regard to these oral traditions, in regard to these things which were turned into effectively laws added to the Torah, what is going on? It's not like they just approached this and said, oh, we're just going to make up a bunch of stuff just because we want to. That at least in a lot of the cases, it was intended to serve as, how are we going to observe this command? And it just got out of hand. And these are the ways that, as I would understand it, it got out of hand. And if we recognize that, then maybe it's not so much about, okay, the rabbis have these views that we disagree with, and the rabbis do things that we don't like, but these very behaviors, these very patterns are extremely similar to what many people engage in, what almost everyone engages in, even unintentionally. One recognition that I've started having, at least more explicitly lately, is that whenever we start delving into certain commands or talking about certain commands, and we are using terminology that does not represent anything that's actually said there. So, for example, the idea of we're only supposed to wear supposedly pure clothing and pure fibers. So Leviticus 19:19, Deuteronomy 22:11, there are references to not wearing a particular kind of garment. And sometimes this is interpreted as a garment of mixed fibers, and I'm going to talk about that. That's actually the subject of the study that I'm working on right now. But sometimes it's referenced as mixed fibers, sometimes it's looked at as a garment of linen and wool, and there are different interpretations as a result. One interpretation that I've seen in the past is that we are supposedly supposed to wear pure garments or pure fibers. And this is an example of something which is not a Torah-based wording. There isn't anything that could be translated as that. There's nothing in those passages that refer to pure. So anytime something like that comes up, especially since it's something that I've been considering, like that general idea is something that's been on my mind for the past few months, whenever something like that comes up, it's an immediate red flag to me because I'm thinking, that's not a textual wording. That's not Torah-based. It's an inference. It's a therefore. Of course, a person might say it makes sense to conclude something like that, but it's dangerous territory. We're delving into the realm of beliefs because we are deviating further and further away from the Torah text. Even if, depending on your way of looking at it, even if it might seem like it makes a lot of sense, or even if it might seem like a general principle that a person could derive from it, depending on the way you're looking at this verse, I think that there has to be a recognition of whenever it is something that is clearly directly in the text, and whenever it is something which is being derived from it, whenever it is deviating from an actual wording in the text. And this gets into the matter of derived principles, taking a Torah command and deriving some kind of principle from it. And of course there's the frame of the Torah as teachings, and so maybe there is some underlying idea that one might derive that goes beyond what it just plainly or literally says. And I could see that in some ways, but if we're thinking about the Torah as a legal document, which it very clearly is, and it clearly, according to the text itself, that there are judgments that are being made through that the judges are using it to make binding legal decisions on people's cases, sometimes to a degree that it involves capital punishment. If we're thinking about it in that light, it might be important to consider where is the line on these derived principles. And had you asked me maybe a year ago, I probably would have said, yeah, I can see how one would apply certain laws beyond just what they explicitly said, but I think there is a question as to where that line is actually being drawn. So one example of that might be Exodus 21, verses 28 through 29. And if you're familiar with the Samaritan Pentateuch reading of this passage, you know that it reads differently, but let's just focus on the Masoretic at first. This is the passage about the ox goring a man or a woman, and then what is supposed to be done with the ox, and what is supposed to be done with the owner of the ox, and different situations with what if the owner knew ahead of time that the ox had been prone to goring, or the ox had gored before. So a question that might arise relating to this command is that, well, we have a bull that's goring, and someone owns a bull and it gores someone. What if the situation were that someone owned a dangerous dog and the dog went out and killed someone? That the dog got loose, or the dog was just allowed to run, and then the dog went and killed someone, and the owner knew that it was a dog that was prone to be aggressive, or a dog that was prone to smite. What if that were the situation instead of a bull? How would we apply the Torah judgment in the Torah society? If we were going off the Samaritan Pentateuch, it would be more clear in this specific example, because it doesn't just say bull here, and it doesn't say goring. It actually says any beast smiting, if I recall correctly. But say either we weren't relying on that, or say it didn't say that. Say we're just relying on this particular manuscript. I can certainly see the case being made to say that this is some general principle that we can derive, and we can apply it more broadly than it directly says. But something I was thinking about the other day in this regard is that at which point is that getting into Deuteronomy 4:2? At which point is that getting into Deuteronomy 13:1 or 12:32, depending on your numbering system, adding to the law? Anytime we're getting into something that it doesn't actually say, we're delving into personal beliefs. We're delving into things which are highly subjective. Even though in this example, maybe it would be deemed reasonable by, just say, 75% of people, that doesn't necessarily get away from the fact that we could be creating a new generalized law that's not actually worded according to the text, and that would easily be infringing upon Deuteronomy 4:2. And this is the problem that I'm recognizing with any kind of derived principle, really, because even though a lot of people may agree on it, we know that a lot of people agree on things which are clearly a violation of the Torah, even if it's something that's a matter of the Torah. That a lot of people agree on particular perspectives which are either based on incorrect traditions, or they're based on incorrect readings and incorrect translations and so forth. So if a person were to say that this command supposedly means that any beast smiting is what the issue is, it's not a bull goring, then the question I would have is that for what reason does it not just say that? The Torah is a legal document. If that were the intended command, if that is what Elohim intended us to read it as, then it's awfully odd that it doesn't actually say that, at least in this manuscript, and of course holding that other issue to the side. So I'm very suspicious of any kind of derived principle, because automatically we're going outside of the text. Automatically we are rewording the law into what we think it should say. To me, it seems like it would be very hard to get past Deuteronomy 4:2 when it comes to these sorts of things. And we can see how these subjective derived principles, these principles which are highly dependent upon personal beliefs, we can see how they exist outside of rabbinic traditions, that they exist in other circles also, even circles which would deny rabbinic traditions or would reject the oral law or the supposed oral Torah. Even if that is being rejected, there may also be the same thing going on unintentionally. Unintentionally creating new commands based on how a certain command is being understood beyond what it actually says. And an aspect which I think is important about this is, in the Torah society, we are dealing in people's lives. And in a system of judgment, do we want to be subject to people's outside of the Torah opinions? Do we want to be subject to people's ways of personally reconciling their own beliefs, their own personal beliefs, with the Torah? Do we want to be subject to that? Because right now, everyone's doing what is right in their own eyes, and that's understandable. That's just the situation that we are in. And in the process of doing that, whenever there's some kind of disagreement, it's easy to say that, well, I just don't think that's right. And so, as a result, just avoiding that discussion, avoiding discussing things with that person, or whatever the case may be. It's easy to do that in this current environment, and the only people that it's directly affecting typically is the person in the discussion. Someone's just going to have the one view or the one conclusion, and the other person's going to have some other conclusion, and in some ways it's just between them and God. Of course, there may be kind of community-related fallout to that, or there may be community influence as a result of that, which may or may not be useful depending on the situation. But overall, most of it is just between you and God in some way. The situation is very different in the Torah society. In that situation, someone could leave. They could pack up and just say, I'm not going to live around these people. I'm going to go live in some other nation that's not actually trying to recognize the Torah. And that may work, but at the same time, what if the situation were that the tabernacle had been reestablished? What if the priesthood was reestablished as should be expected by what the Torah says? In some other situation, in the situation that we're in now, someone could easily get away with saying that even though a command may not explicitly say a certain way, I'm going to observe it this way, or even though maybe the Torah doesn't say that we have to go to this certain extent, but I'm going to do it just because it fits with my personal beliefs, and I think that it's better to do it that way anyway, it fits with my personal wisdom, etc. We can easily say that, but what are we going to do if the situation is actual legal justice? Obviously, there are going to be a series of huge hurdles before even getting to that point, before even getting into that situation, because most of us are probably so much in the idea of leave me alone and I'll leave you alone, or I'm going to do what I think's right and then you can do what you think's right. I mean, everyone doing what is right in their own eyes, and that's very understandable. That's easy to see as reasonable in current circumstances and in circumstances that have led to this point. But moving past that, it's clear that there's an additional level of seriousness that I think needs to go into our analysis of things. And I'm not just saying this regarding other people or something like that. I'm saying it also for myself, because it's inevitable that either past beliefs that I've had or ideas that I've had that may not be entirely in line with the Torah are going to come in at some point, and hopefully I am going to be able to confront them, but maybe I won't realize them for a while. And my underlying point is that I think an additional layer of seriousness with this would involve making sure that we're focusing on the Torah wordings, that we're not focusing on the therefores, and that we're catching ourselves anytime these therefores come up, anytime these ideas or these explanations come up which are not Torah-based wordings, which are not Hebrew wordings or not referring to a Hebrew wording in the text. Obviously, it's not simple. Obviously, it's not easy. But I think it is something worth considering. It's something I invite us to continue to consider as we go forward. Thanks for watching. Stay focused and be tenacious.